Hey guys, so I'm doing a review of Stephen King's novel Hearts in Atlantis. Most people regard it as just a collection of related short stories and novellas, whereas I regard it as a novel told through interconnected short stories and novellas. So I'm going to be reading straight from my notes because there's a lot to talk about, so I'm just going to jump right in. So to summarize the book as a whole, it's a series of interconnected novellas and short stories that form, in my opinion, an overall novel. The whole thing is a meditation on the 1960s, and it's King's view that the youth of that decade that tried to make a difference for the world ended up failing, uh, as well as his view of how surreal the events of that era were and how they were too weird to accurately explain. And it's also full of themes of failure and disappointment, such as the prevalent themes of Bobby growing up and failing to hold on to his adolescence, as well as his less than natural failure of holding on to being kind of a good person and doing moral things because he becomes a hoodlum as an adolescent. Uh, so the first story in the book is called "Low Men in Yellow Coats," and it's a novella that opens the book, and it's the longest story in the book. It's very it's very long, but it's very good, and it's definitely worth the read. So I'm just gonna read my notes straight off. So basically, it's about Bobby. He's an average kid of his time. He wants to be a writer. He likes to read. At the beginning of the novella, he turns 11 and gets an adult library card, which is the first sign of oncoming adulthood. And after that, he ditches Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys for Clifford Simak's Ring Around the Sun. He befriends Ted, an older gentleman who comes to stay on the third floor of the apartment building he lives in. He has a distant relationship with his mother, who he understands more on a subconscious level, although isn't too understanding of her motives or business with the man that she stays late for at her job. Bobby's father has died, and his mother hasn't gotten over resentment and hatred for him. This meanness is the cause for her cold demeanor towards her son. Bobby has two best friends, solely John Silverman, who shares Bobby's interest in comics, American Bandstand, and going to see movies at the Empire Theater. His other bestie is Carol Gerber, who the mean older kids all call the Gerber baby. She shares these interests with Bobby as well as a hint at deeper interest in Bobby as more than a friend. Bobby and Ted become friends when Bobby realizes Ted shares his love of books. Ted recommends a bunch of books to Bobby to broaden his horizons. Among them are Lord of the Flies, which becomes a recurring source of imagery and a narrative parallel to the events to come later, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and Day of the Triffids, as well as another Golding book, The Inheritors. Bobby is immediately taken with Golding and is blown away by flies. He loves how mature it is, though he wisely also knows that it's the kind of thing his mother would confiscate if she caught him reading, because while she may be cold, she's also trying to play the parental figure and keep him out of things that she deems smut. She also distrusts Ted from the get-go, calling him Mr. Bradigan. She immediately suspects him of being some kind of lowlife on the move, and she doesn't want to take too kindly to Bobby's growing friendship with him. But Bobby doesn't care. He sees Ted Brodigan as the cool guy he is. Though Bobby is also immediately aware that Ted isn't exactly what he appears. As the story progresses, it becomes clear that Ted isn't just a retiree living out his last days in the apartment. But he's also something else. Something possibly not even human, but nevertheless benevolent. Bobby discovers that Ted can read minds and sense people's true intentions. He demonstrates this gift, and in a later scene involving a card trickster, Bobby adopts this skill, beating the card cheat of his own game. Ted confides that he is indeed on the run, not from cops, but from a shadowy group of entities called the Low Men in Yellow Coats. He tells Bobby that they're coming for him and to look out for them by the coded communications they leave for each other, in the form of drawing stars and moons on hopscotch chalk games, hanging kite ribbons from telephone wires, and posting missing pet posters around town. Bobby is scared, but he promises he'll be careful. Eventually, he starts to see signs of the element everywhere, but thinks he's losing his mind, so he doesn't say anything. He tries to ignore these warnings by going about his life of hanging out with Ted, going to monster movies with solely John and Carol, and reading grown-up fiction. The golden imagery comes back when Bobby has a dark and almost psychic dream about his mother being chased by the ugly men in her world, hunting her like a pig in the hotel she's staying at for a job. Chased by naked, perverse men who act like the wild boys in Golding's jungle. They're also displaying a red eye, which is a symbol from King's Dark Tower mythos, which runs through much of his work and through this novel as well. Then towards the end of the story, Carol's attacked, and she's badly beaten by the dickheads from St. Gabe's, which are the older boys. Her former friend, Willie Sherman, who was once a friend of hers, holds her down while the other mean kids proceed to work her over with a baseball bat. They beat her so badly that they dislocate her shoulder. And when they realize how badly they've hurt her, they ditch her in a grove of trees. Bobby just happens to come along and take her back to Ted's to help her. Ted puts her on his lap and inspects her. Ted puts her on her lap and inspects her injuries. I can't talk. In order to set her dislodged shoulder, he's forced to remove her shirt. But Bobby's mother comes home from an insurance seminar where she had previously been raped by her boss, and walks in on this. Right away, she gets the wrong impression. Ted has helped Carol and explains the situation for what it is. However, Bobby later learns that his mother's reported Ted's whereabouts to the low men. And I was wondering, is the low men a possible reference to Willie Loman from Miller's Death of a Salesman? The men come from Ted and take him away. Bobby begs them to let Ted stay. They instead give him the option to come with them, but to a destination unknown. Bobby chooses to stay behind and he hates himself for it. They haul Ted away into a car that in itself is sinister in its own way. Now it's described. It's almost like living. It's very creepy. And then Bobby watches him go. There's an epilogue after that, and I'll read from it in a second, but the majority of the story is like all of these events I just explained, and then in the last few pages, this epilogue comes in. So, epilogue. We get an epilogue of Bobby as a teenager. He's become a criminal and has been in 2 juvenile centers by this point. He's also moved from Connecticut to Maine and gradually lost touch with his childhood pals. He's grown up and has abandoned the days of playing baseball and reading science fiction in favor of breaking windows. He still lives with his mother, who is at a loss for what to do for her son at this point. And one day, Bobby gets a letter from Ted. It's full of rose petals, and roses are an important part of the Dark Tower mythology in King's work, of which Ted is actually a big part of. The silent symbol tells him that Ted has once again escaped the low men. This letter strikes... A silent letter shakes him to his core and gives him a sense of hope and purpose. So much so that he realizes how stupid he's been and straightens up. The story ends with him talking to his mother, telling her that they'll get by the best they can. So here's my closing thoughts on it. So that's the first story. It's novella length and it's full of all these characters in our lives, both the major players and minor characters who orbit the story. And most of these characters will return in later stories in the book. New ones will appear as well. Having first read, this is the part where I talk about some personal stuff in my history with Hearts in Atlantis. So I first read the book when I was about 11 or 12, which is, for the most part was Bobby's age. And it played a big part in my own evolution as a reader. And it was actually one of the first mature books that I read, much like how Bobby was discovering things like Ring Around the Sun and Lord of the Flies. This was one of the big novels that were one of the first more mature things that I read, and made me realize that, stories could be very deep and very realistic and have excellent writing, and and be and move me on the level of art that other things that I had found it moved me. I wrote here in my notes. I said, let me go back. I said it played a huge part in my own evolution as a reader, and it was one of the first really mature books I read, and it's the perfect time to read it. It also showed me the realities of adulthood and the issues grown-ups face and the things about being a kid they either ignore or forget. I reread it again as a teenager, and again it showed me what grown-up life was like and the world just out at my fingertips. I wasn't a juvie like Bobby, but I was a teenage dumbass in my own way, and this book was my own calling to see how much depth life and art can have. The third time I read it was just about a year or so ago. This time related to it more than I ever had before, and I saw it for all it is. A brilliant work of entertainment, a serious examination of human nature and the effect of what we do and don't accomplish. A depiction of a decade I can't even really imagine living through, and I really can't. As well as a poetic work that shows that the human spirit can overcome adversity even when we think we're too far gone. It was so moving I actually cried when I finished it the third time. And that's what King's work does so well. It makes us see ourselves in his characters, in our own situations, in their situations. This is definitely one of King's best books, and whether you consider it a novel or just a book of connected stories, it's beautifully written, vivid in its realism, and demonstrates what an eye for character and an ear for dialogue the man has for characters. And, I go on to talk about just kind of like how it's one of his best books, and it definitely is. This is definitely like in my top 10. If someone were to ask me to compile a list of Stephen King's like best fiction, Hearts in Atlantis would be like probably 5 out of 10. It stands up there to me with like his best writing, like It, The Stand, The Body, Dolores Claiborne, Lisey's Story. Like those are some of like his best like novels and stories, and I think this definitely is in that company. And I really would put it somewhere in the top 5 if I were to numerically make a list. So, anyways, that's Low Men in Yellow Coats. There was a few extra things that I didn't go into that happened in the story, but those are more just kind of touches of realism and things that kind of like hold all the core events together. But there's a lot going on, and it's very vivid in like how much it kind of talks about all the characters and how realistic it feels. Like it feels very intimate, like you're reading kind of almost like a memoir of like this time that somebody had lived through. But like I said, it's King on his A game. It's fantastic. And even if you don't like horror, you can definitely read it, because while there is horror in here, there's also like a lot of hope. There's a lot of sense of joy and a sense of nostalgia for a distant time. Especially distant to people like me who weren't even there, weren't even alive yet. So anyways, that's the first story, novella called Low Men in Yellow Coats. I'm going to be doing a series of videos talking about each story in Hearts in Atlantis. So this will be kind of like the first episode of a mini-series. So thank you again for watching. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about Hearts in Atlantis and about the story in Hearts in Atlantis. And thank you for just watching my videos in general. I always appreciate it. You guys are fantastic. And I'll try to have another video soon where I talk about the second story in Hearts in Atlantis, which is the title story, Hearts in Atlantis. So this first story is set in the town of Harwich, Connecticut in 1960, and the second story, called Hearts in Atlantis, is set at the University of Maine in Orano in the year 1966. So that'll be episode 2. So again, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. You guys are amazing. And if you like this, please subscribe. Smash that like button, as I say. So anyways, I will see you in the next one. Later. was really thirsty.